today's class we are we left off talking about Kandinsky. Just briefly at the end of last class, we mentioned that what happened to Kandinsky during the war, right? We'd left Kandinsky off having sort of around 1913 beginning to embrace issues of abstraction. He is at that point an expatriate living in Munich, right? He's a Russian national, but he's living in Munich, and that is where the Blue Rider Group is situated, and where Kandinsky makes his initial inroads into abstraction, right? And pens all of his ideas about colors and symbols and whatnot. And when the war breaks out, the same thing happens in Germany that happens in France. We talked about in France that, Picasso had to go back to Spain during the war, right? And Braque served in the war. So it interrupted Cubism in its developments around 1914, right? In Germany, Kandinsky went back to Russia, went back home. And when he goes to Russia, he winds up, I think it's in Moscow, but I'm not 100% sure, living in the same building as Lissitzky, right? They're not roommates or anything, but it's an apartment building, and they're in the same building. And Kandinsky's moves toward abstraction begin to take on a constructivist flair, a constructivist viewpoint. Although he doesn't share, because of his own personal bent, right? He doesn't share everything with the constructivists. And when we were talking about the constructivists, we mentioned that there were these two camps, right? There was the materialist camp, right? The one that was sort of populist, art serves the state, right? Lissitzky's kind of in that camp. And then there was the sort of spiritual camp, that art and abstraction are a way of bridging the gap between the physical world and the spiritual realm. And obviously, given Kandinsky's predilections, this is where he's going to end up, right? You don't expect him to be converted into some sort of rationalist, and it doesn't happen. He really is the heir to Malevich in the constructivist camp about art as spiritual, right? Art as a way of still bridging that gap, right? But as you can see, compared to his earlier work, right, Kandinsky's work at this point becomes more geometric, much more constructivist looking. At the same time, he doesn't have what Lissitzky have, which is this sense of construction, for lack of a better word, right, of architectural motifs. Or where they're there, they end up being divorced a bit further from architecture, right? There's nothing that appears like that wiry bit in the lower right corner of the Lissitzky, right? Or any of the stuff around the geometric shapes. They all take a three-dimensional structural sort of look in Lissitzky, but Kandinsky never really goes there, right? They just remain these shapes, even though they're much more geometricized than he had been during his Blue Rider phase, right? So he rides out World War I in Russia, right? And begins to make works of art that still have some of the earlier Kandinsky style, but become significantly more geometric. And he discusses his new interest in geometry. Kandinsky's always writing at the same time that he's painting. He's always writing, right? He's very, unlike other artists, or many other artists, he's very, very clear about what he wants to achieve. And so we talked about the fact that during the Blue Rider phase, the primary, not the only, but the primary, the principal writing by Kandinsky was concerning the spiritual in art, where he talks about color. He talks about the symbolic, emotional, expressive, spiritual elements of color, right? All of which are derived from how color appears in the world around us, but he tries to extract from that its symbolic quotient, right? So blue is spiritual because it's the sky. But he wants blue to be the spiritual independent of being the sky, which is why he'll use it elsewhere, right? Okay. As he becomes a constructivist, of course, geometric forms are going to become more important to him than they had been in the past, right? So during the Blue Rider phase, almost all of Kandinsky's work was, how do I want to say this? Biomorphic almost, right? It was amoebic. These words mean anything to you guys? You know what I'm talking about? They were sort of, they were biological looking, right? They were natural looking. They had curves and whatnot, right? You didn't see angles and you didn't see circles, right? You have a word for me?
We said organic.
Organic, that's exactly the word I wanted. Organic is the word I want. Thank you so much. You get up here and you just get tongue-tied, right? Yeah, high, low five. There you go.
I thought you were
Yeah.
like,
Talk to the hand. Yes, they're much more organic in its early phase. And some of that still exists, right? You can still see elements where there's sort of organic elements. Some of the lines, for example, here, get my pen out, right? Some of the lines down in here, or some of the areas over in here, right, have a sort of, still have that organic formulation, but he's becoming increasingly geometric. And as he does, he writes his second really major book. Now, that's not to suggest that he's not writing in between these things, right? Because he writes a lot. But there are these two sort of major treatises during his career. Concerning the Spiritual is all about color. And then in the early 20s, he writes Point and Line to the Plane, which is primarily about shape and geometry. And he takes it from sort of the same point of view that each one of these shapes also has a very metaphysical connection, right? That they can help his paintings move from this world to the next, right? He sees these geometric forms, each of them, as bearing meaning. But not a meaning, you would say like, the circle is an egg, or something like that. Something so simple as that, right? But rather that they bear these expressive meanings to where things can make multiple references at once, be, as you might say, multivalent, right? Speak many languages at once.
Is
Lena.
that similar to how he explained color having meaning as well?
Exactly right. It's just now shifting focus, right? No, I've never read Point and Line to the Plane cover to cover. I have read the other one. And I'd like to get back into it at some point and see if he's still talking about color. But I do know from what I've read about it, right, that he's focusing more, and the title suggests this, doesn't it? Point, line, plane, right? Suggests that it's about geometric shapes, right, rather than about color. But I don't think that he's ever going to give up his interest in color and its form. And one of the quotes that I drew from this is that Kandinsky says, "I love the circle today as I used to love the horse." Right? For instance, and perhaps even more, he said, than I used to love the horse, since I found more inner potentialities in the circle, which is why it has taken the horse's place. He loves circles, right? So the circle for him means what the horse used to mean. Now, what did the horse used to mean? It was something that he sort of deployed everywhere, right? So we'll bring up one of our horses, right? We saw horses running, nice man, horses running rampant, a stampede of horses in early Kandinsky, going up hills, going down trails, abstracted into some of the organic lines that ran through his compositions, right? Now, in the new works, we see more circles. And I think that he replaces the horse with something else, primarily because the horse kind of locks it down, because it's referential to things in this world. A circle leaves the potential for meaning that much more open, right? And this is why he said, I find more inner potentialities in the circle, right, than he used to find in the horse. Now, our image on the right, Small Worlds, right, is a series of lithographs, or one of a series of lithographs. And actually, it was from a group of prints that Kandinsky had done and that he issued as a portfolio. This is a non-bound book, right? So a box full of Kandinsky prints that you could buy. Nice, right? And some of them were colored lithographs. So we talked about lithographs, right? We didn't? Yeah, we did. We like stone images. So each of the colors is a different matrix, right? Unlike, for example, a woodblock where you would put different colors on the same block, or could. Each one of the blues is a block, the yellows are a block, the greens, and they're registered one over the other as it's printed. So a colored lithograph. Now this is one of 3 different printmaking techniques that were contained together in the portfolio. So when you opened up your portfolio of works, you got works by Kandinsky, and some of them were colored lithographs, some of them were intaglio prints. Remember we talked about that, right? Intaglio are etchings and engravings and dry points, right? Where you scratch or carve or use acid to bite into a plate, and you rub the ink down into the cracks and polish off the flats, right? So some of them were intaglio prints. And then some of them were woodcuts. And not all of them were in color. And Kandinsky, as you might guess, also found that each of the 3 printmaking processes, the process itself, also had symbolic implications. Just the nature of the technique, right? And what he said about lithography was that it was the most modern, which is, of course, it was historically, right? Woodcuts in the history of Western printmaking are the earliest that we have. Early 15th century are the earliest woodcuts that we can find, right? Intaglio, engravings to begin with, because they didn't know how to use the acids yet, right? We get by the end of the 15th century, sometime around 1440s, 50s. Whereas wood blocks, we can find woodcuts going back to around 1400. Lithography doesn't really exist until the 19th century. And because it's a chemical process that treats the stone and its ability to hold or repel water, right? It chemically treats the properties of the stone, is of course a very modern way of printmaking. And for Kandinsky, he sees it as the most modern, and he also says that it is by its own nature the most democratic. Because from the properly made lithograph, you can get many, many, many more impressions than you can from a woodblock or from an intaglio plate. Right? And lithos, because they were primarily used in Kandinsky's time as newspaper illustrations rather than high art, right, added to that democratic element of the work. So for you art students in here, the important thing to think about is that the choice of medium by which we project our message does actually have some impact on that message, right? And that all you good artists deliberate about everything and consider its potential for the ideas, the messages you're trying to get across, right? So for Kandinsky, with this box, you got works that are, and woodcuts, were considered to be more low art. Intaglios, through the history of collecting, are the things that connoisseurs really go for, much more collectible in a way. And Kandinsky sees all of these things in each of the different techniques that he's using in 1922 for Small Worlds. Another of these prints from the 20s, he does both of these after having come back to Germany. After the war, Kandinsky returns, right? He spends most of his active career in Germany. Although he will travel later when the Nazis come to power, he will move again in the 1930s, this time not back to Russia, but to Paris, right? Which will end up being a problem because the Nazis will be there eventually too. If you've ever seen Casablanca, you know this, right? So he's doing these after having moved back to Germany. And he had come back to Germany in 1921, right? So not immediately after the war, right? Not in 1918, but in 1921. And he had come back because he was invited to come back to teach. In 1919, a new school had been founded in Germany, a school of architecture, and design, called the Bauhaus. Right? Which is, if we're studying modern art, something you better come out of here knowing. The Bauhaus as a way of approaching design had more influence than maybe anything when it comes to design principles. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. Right? So Kandinsky comes to Germany to work at the Bauhaus in 1921. He's going to be a teacher. And continue to, imagine this, you have color theory with Kandinsky, right? He taught foundations courses. He taught the 100 level things, right? And the Bauhaus was set up around working from the pragmatics of basic design and basic color theory through fabricating objects, where you would take classes that are just, how does glass behave? How do you work with glass? How do you work with wood? How do you work with metal, right? To eventually the idea is that you would work your way toward the building. By the time you got to the building, you knew exactly what concrete did. You knew exactly what marble does. You knew exactly what wood does. And you also had all these other ideas coming in about the nature of color, right? The nature of form and what it can all mean. And the people that were teaching at the Bauhaus were so this incredible lineup of modern artists that came to teach. It's this sort of this, you know, what do you want to say, this golden moment for modern art, right? And so Kandinsky's invited back, right, to teach. It was a government-sponsored school, which is a little bit interesting to think about, something as avant-garde as this being sponsored by the government. But the government in Germany, immediately following the war, was in fact very, very liberal, very, very open-minded, very, very forward-looking, right? Also incredibly, surprisingly wealthy, but the wealth was polarized, right? So we'll talk more about that. This is the Weimar Republic, and that'll come up on one of the slides. Weimar, the Weimar Republic, after the war, right? So here is the Bauhaus School. It was originally founded by Walter Gropius in 1919. In one city, they ended up having to move because the local government didn't like what they were doing. They moved to Dessau, the famous Bauhaus building by Gropius and his partner Adolf Meyer. Gropius was the original head of the Bauhaus. He was the one that was elected by the Weimar government to found this. Bauhaus means, if you don't speak German, bauen is to build, the German word for to build, bauen, and house is house, right? So built house is really what, right? Or to build a house, if you will. That's what Bauhaus really means. It's all about housing being built. And the whole point of founding this in 1919, the year after the war, was that Germany was pretty badly damaged in the war. And what they wanted to do at the Bauhaus was to come up with a way of rebuilding Germany that did two things at the same time. One, did it efficiently, because so much had to get done. And two, used industry for that, right? Wedding design with industry would allow for more streamlined production. Okay, so, but not sacrificing the aesthetic value, right? We often think of things that are done for mass production as kind of being a little on the sucky side when it comes to the design principles. But the Bauhaus's idea was to say, we are going to make things for mass production that at the same time do not skimp on the thoughtfulness and beauty of the design, right? So quick and efficient, but beautiful, right? And to do this was to understand the nature of the materials, right? And so Gropius is given an utterly free rein. They give him a school with faculty members already in place, and he starts to found this new curriculum and put everything together, and almost everybody quits because it's so untraditional, and Gropius gets to hire whoever he wants. And he puts together this sort of, this dream team, right, of avant-garde artists who are going to come and teach, right, together. And because of what we've seen happening in the teens, as you might imagine, the constructivists are going to be somebody he really likes to turn to, guys, because the constructivists are already interested in using art to reflect the nature of materials, right? The forms should be based on the nature of the material that the form is made from. That was one of the constructivist ideas, right? And how different materials and different forms can come together, and the beauty of the object, right, should be transparent to its original materials. That was also picked up by the Bauhaus, right? So Gropius is picking up Kandinsky because Kandinsky is kind of in the constructivist school, and we're going to find that right around 1920, as he's stocking up the Bauhaus, he's stocking it up with constructivists. And this is all well and good, but it's going to become sort of a problem for him, because the constructivists, Kandinsky's not one of them, but the constructivists are by and large communists. And, anywhere but Russia, communists tend not to have a very good public reception, right? And this will be a problem for the Bauhaus, being filled with all these commies, right? But at the same time, if you think about one of the ethoses of communism, which is that everyone should enjoy the same sort of benefits from society, right? That we're building for society, so they sort of looked attractive. Lena, you had your hand up.
So, one thing, why does this look like if Gaiac actually had aesthetic?
Sorry, what's that?
Like, it looks like a prison. I don't think it's
This or
yes,
that?
it looks like a prison. There's bars on the windows.
No, there are. There are panes on the windows.
No,
okay.
on the side. Look,
It's not
those
bars.
are panes. They look like bars.
That's the side.
It doesn't look aesthetic. It looks like prison.
Well,
Oh.
it's a fun. Well, there's a reason for this. Okay. So like I said, that it looks like a prison. And yes, okay. One of the things that the Bauhaus does architecturally, there are very few Bauhaus buildings. One of the interesting things about the Bauhaus, and you might expect this when Kandinsky is teaching you your foundation level classes, right?
You're not painting in a building.
That they're not going to really get to the building part of things, right? And there are only, there are Bauhaus inspired buildings, but actual buildings that came out of the Bauhaus, right? Few and far between. This is one of them. And Hunter's comment, this is all part of this. This is answering your question, but you brought up a very important and very sort of interwoven and complex question. Why does it look like a prison? Okay. One of the things you'll notice is that this is all part of the school. That each part of the school looks different, right? This building here doesn't look like that one back there. That's the dormitories, right? And the building over there, which is the executive offices, doesn't quite look like this one either, or like this one, right? Form, this is the central ethos of Bauhaus, which derives from constructivism. Form follows function. Have you heard that phrase before? Form follows function. That's from the Bauhaus. And so, for Walter Gropius as an architect, for anybody that designs, and they make other things, they make teapots, chairs, right? Lighting fixtures, food storage containers. lamps. Form follows function. Okay? These are functional buildings, and by that, what it means is that the form of this is based only on its function and not adorned in any way. Okay? There's no decoration on it, except for the name Bauhaus. And you'll notice, even the letters in Bauhaus are all sans serif. Right? There's no adornment to the letters. They are simple. They're machine-like in a way, and even the buildings are machine-like in a way. Right? They are there to produce something. Okay? So form follows function. So the students' housing has good bright windows, but also has balconies. Each of the students' houses has its own balcony. I think these are for married couples, and the single houses have a smaller balcony. This is the workshop. So the bit that you see as you misunderstood as bars is a curtain wall of glass that allows ample light into every one of the studios, but also functions as a metaphor. Imagine if art had better lighting
That's
than
what
this,
I
right?
said. If
Or,
Gaia
you know,
looked better.
I know, exactly. Well, GAIAC was never designed to be an art building, you see. When GAIAC was put up, it was put up as a multi-purpose box. And we shoehorned all of our art studios into that. Whether it's a design studio or they have been shoehorned into a building that was not purpose designed for that. This is purpose designed, so the floors are taller than they would be over here, right? Because you need that extra space, that extra allows more light into a room to have a higher ceiling, right? Floor to ceiling windows allow that, but it's also a metaphor because the idea of the Bauhaus was it's making designs for society. So transparency, what goes on in here, there's no secret to what goes on in here, right? So now, why does it look like a prison? Because prisons are form follows function, right? They are all about incarceration, and all of the things that they choose are about boxing in and separating out, and also not spending any money on adorning, right? So there is a certain, we've tended to associate unadorned, flat-topped buildings with crap, right? Bad architecture. And I don't want to, I think some prison architecture are kind of cool in it as an aesthetic thing, right? But they too have this idea of being incredibly functional, being very spared for that functionality. And that is, I think, why the two might seem so similar. Now, I see where you're coming from, although I told you this, right? That I think the Bauhaus is a spectacular building, partly because I just love modernism. I think high modern is just amazing. We've got the DC Public Library down by the Smithsonian American Museum is by the third leader of the Bauhaus, Mies van der Rohe, right? And has that same sort of stripped down spare, where the architecture doesn't do much to hide the materials it's working with. And this goes back to something, I'm so far off my notes, we're never going to get anywhere in this one. You don't care? I don't care.
We're learning.
That's a good thing. When we talked about Mondrian, when we talked about Malevich, when we talked about Kandinsky, but mostly with Mondrian and Malevich, one of the things we talked about was the fact that when you pair art away from representation, when you get down to the fact that all you got is paint on the canvas, you better be careful about how you handle the paint on the canvas, because that's what you've got, right? That's all there is to look at. No sort of imagining yourself and being struck with the artist's ability to draw puppies and horses, right? The materials, when you get to minimal art, right, minimal abstraction, the materials you use become that much more important. And how you handle those materials becomes that much more important, right? Because that's what we're looking at. We're not looking at representation. We're looking at the materials. With architecture, the same thing holds true. When you get a kind of architecture where there are no adornments to really look at, then the materials you use better be good. This is our GAIAC analogy. As is what brought that up. This thing is made out of cheap-ass cinder block, right? This is a cinder block building, right? And it shows through. It's actually true to its materials in a certain way, right? So if you look inside, look on the walls outside, you see those 18 by 9 or 10-inch cinder blocks that are held together with mortar and sit on a metal frame. Okay? It's true to its materials, but it's pretty cruddy material. Right? And a good modernist building, like the Bauhaus, will pare it down, show its materials. And again, think about constructivism, right? Show the materials it's made from. Those are going to be pretty nice materials. Think of Gabo. Think of if non-Gabo had made one of those constructions and used pieces of wood that were half-assed cut and maybe some string that wasn't strung too tightly. Would it be any good at all? It's because of the materials he's using and the rigor with which he's handling them is what makes it good, right? Ditto. The materials he's using, the rigors with his hand. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about architectural symbolism, but you enter through a door on the corner. The workshops are raised by a level. We've got a base that is overhead height. So there's this idea of art elevating us above the world, right? And open to the sky and part of the world around you. And that transparency metaphor that anybody out there can see what's going on in here, but it's a bit of both as well, right? Because they're artists, right? And they're designers, and they get to change the future. And I have some other things to show from this, right? But whoops, that's not what I meant to do. Hang on. That's always a bad thing to hear, isn't it? That's not what I meant to do. Oh, there we go. Right? So here we're looking at the corner of the workshop block, and you can see how open it is, right? Looking through that corner. And again, revealing industrial materials used in an unadorned fashion so that the building becomes the materials and really very little more, right? There's a street that runs this way, and there's a side street that runs this way, and it goes right through the campus. So this building is connected to the administrative block. This is where faculty offices and whatnot are. But there's also faculty buildings. They lived on campus, right? So a bunch of buildings for faculty members as well. But it's connected by a sky bridge that runs over the top. So there's this idea of interpermeation of society in the Bauhaus, right? We're not necessarily separate, even though there's that elevation thing that we see in the student workforce.
Elevation, though.
Sorry?
But everyone has that elevation.
Exactly
And
right.
the
He's
students.
very careful about all the way through, sort of coming up with these subtle little metaphors, right? Of the entry level, the ground floor. Floor 1 has a different look than the other ones up above, right? So there's this entry between. So, and I think with this degree, you can begin to see how he really works with the different sorts of fenestration, fancy word for window layout, right? In each one of them, so on the entry to the administrative block, the whole stairwell is glazed in, right? So we can see that and find our way in, right? So anyway, the Bauhaus, long and short of it, right, is this, because this isn't in a local collection or anything, is this school where design principles are being taught around ideas of that, many of which parallel the constructivists, right? Which is that form follows function, right? That's not a far cry from form following materials, right? There's a certain analogy between these two. And this is why when Gropius founds the Bauhaus, he begins to stock it with these avant-garde artists from all over Europe, right, that he knows.
Do we still have the Bauhaus as a school?
That's a very good question. What happened after the war? This is, okay. I don't have this in my notes. I'm going to go on memory here, so I might make a name or two mistake here. When the Bauhaus Hitler closed the Bauhaus, 1931 or 32. Hitler closed the Bauhaus. Because Hitler doesn't like modern art. Bottom line. I mean, there's lots of reasons for this. He was an artist himself. He's a very traditionalist, but also modern art's challenging, right? And a lot of you are coming to talk to me about your stuff, right? And you're saying, like, but how do I see it? And modern art makes us do that. They want you to see it differently than I do, right? Okay, Hitler closed the house because he doesn't want you thinking like an individual. He wants you thinking. So Hitler's art, the stuff he likes, is stuff that's like, duh. What's the meaning here? It's like, shovel in the face. It's straightforward and simple.
Well, I was wondering this like a few weeks ago when we were talking about like Kirkner, like didn't they get their principles from the same like guy or something? So like why didn't he like that stuff? Do you know what I mean?
Say that again.
Because Kirkner and Hitler like got their principles from the same place. Like,
Oh, from Nietzsche. You're right. That's a really good
doesn't
point.
make sense to me.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Ellie. So we talked about Nietzsche, or we talked about Kirchner. Remember Kirchner? Of course, he's on the midterm. You remember Kirchner, right? Everybody's just like, some of you poorly, and it's like, oh, Kirchner is my nemesis. Kirchner's ideas and the Bridges ideas come right out of Nietzsche, which is the idea that we are all on our way to evolving into a race of supermen. We all being white men. And if that's what he likes, and he likes the ideas of Nietzsche, or Kirchner's on Nietzsche, and Hitler likes Nietzsche, why doesn't Hitler like Kirchner? A is to B, and B is to C, then why isn't A to C? And I don't want to put ideas in Hitler's head. You know what I mean? Or think for some idea that I somehow can think like he did. But the bottom line is that Hitler really hates modern art and probably thinks that there's a better way to get there. That he may have liked if he understood at all what Kirchner was trying to do. He may have thought there was a better way to get there. What he didn't like about Kirchner, and one of them is the element of modern art in general that he does not like. He does not like non-representational art. He likes things to be very classical and traditional. So, the same year that Kirchner's stuff went into that degenerate art show, Hitler opened another show right across town called the Exhibition of Great German Art. And they were all of these sort of Softig women in the landscape, based on traditional themes like the Judgment of Paris, Greek mythology sort of translated into modern images. Lots of people of great German workers, with blood and soil, one of their major mantras, blood and soil, working the land, strong German people building a new German future, right? And depicted in a way that there is no question whatsoever about what it means. Right? But you get a Kirchner who gives you icky German people doing icky things, right? Prostitutes in the landscape, illustrated in a way that resembles African sculpture. Right? Primitive is non-Western, not just African, but it's also things from the islands, right? Indonesia and whatnot. That for Hitler, with his ideas of the super race, is wrong. See, he only sees the forward line. He only sees the forward movement. He doesn't think about that idea of addressing the backward. Right? So I think that's in the long and short of it, that's kind of what's the problem with Kirchner is the embrace of what Europeans call primitivism, right? Non-Western art from Africa and from Micronesia. And also then the fact that once art moves away from traditional faithful representation, there is far too much room for individual interpretation. And for a fascist, for a dictator, individual interpretation is not a good thing. Right? And I think this is well worth pausing over, because the idea of thinking independent from what you're told to think is something that's come under fire recently. And if modern art teaches us anything, right? You don't have to. I've told you guys all one-on-one. I didn't like modern art when I was your age. I just didn't like it. I thought it was a big snowstorm. I thought it was just like this people, snake oil salesmen trying to sell us stuff that, would say it's good, but a bunch of crap, right? That's how I thought about it. But I think the lesson of it, even if you don't like it, even if you're still kind of where I was when I was 1925, which is perfectly fine. The lesson is that if anybody tells you that you know how to think, you better be careful. Somebody wants to exclude you from something because they don't like its message. It's a scary time when that happens. Right? And we're not there yet. We're not anywhere near there yet. We get attacks on the media, but we are not anywhere near something like this in this world. But we have seen times in the last 20 years where works of art were taken down by governments simply because some people didn't like what they were seeing. And it had nothing to do with, there's last week or week before, something was yanked out of the Guggenheim because of protest. It was an animal cruelty issue. And I have very mixed feelings about this, right? Animal cruelty is. But other things, which is like my morals are offended by this, well, nothing's been hurt by it. There was a big show in Brooklyn in the late 90s, 99, the Sensation Show, young British artist, which included this amazing British artist named Chris O'Feely, who took African tribal art, he's of African descent, and took African tribal art and made sort of modern icons, huge, 8 foot. There's one of the Virgin Mary that was done in traditional African materials melded with sort of late medieval gilding. Stunning, gorgeous things. But some of the material was elephant dung. And at the time in New York, in Brooklyn, Rudy Giuliani was a Catholic. He was the mayor of New York, and he demanded that the show be brought down because the Virgin Mary should never be depicted on a canvas using elephant dung. He saw it as disrespectful. In fact, it was anything but, right? And the show had other things in it, and it was intended to shock. It's called sensation, right? Bottom line, right? When a government intervenes and says we don't want this because my morals are offended, right? Without sort of giving us any kind of elaborate reason why that is, it's a really scary place to be in, right? So Bauhaus will eventually be shut down by Hitler simply because one, there's a bunch of commies there, right? That's part of it. Okay, that's his argument. The other is that Hitler wants for Germany a German architecture, which is to say little chalets, sort of Bavarian, Alpine chalets, pitched roofs, these flat factories. Right? The biggest analysis, Hunter, that people bring up is that it looks like a factory. And indeed, that's kind of intentional. It's a factory for art, right? But he thinks factories should look like factories, and museums should look like museums, right? And houses should look like houses have always looked. And this is part of the reason he shuts it down. Okay? Now, this came out of even before your question, there was another question I was answering, so I'm trying to work my way back out of the
yes
maze.
or no whether or not Bauhaus is still here.
Yes, that's the question. Yes, it is. That's the question. Thank you. I see the exit sign. Yes, it is. This is not here as a school anymore. I mean, this is there, but it is not a functioning school.
All right.
When the Bauhaus was closed by Hitler, you don't get interrupted. When the Bauhaus was closed by Hitler, what happened to all these artists? Fantastic artists, right? So, Joseph Alters was teaching form. He ends up at the Black Mountain School for the Arts in Asheville, North Carolina. Fantastic. Do you know about this? Fantastic art school. The legacy there. It is one of my design teachers as an undergrad went to Black Mountain, so I'm the sort of spiritual grandson of the Bauhaus, in a way, right? Not that I got anything from it or knew anything about that. Okay, so, and that became one of the standard bearers for design teaching in America. Okay, Mies van der Rohe went to the Chicago Art Institute, right? Another major hotbed, right? Gropius, Harvard, right? So the people that came out of the Bauhaus when the Bauhaus fragmented and went everywhere, right? When Hitler broke it up, they ended up sort of just like, it's like you've got a dandelion, you go, right, and then all of a sudden they're everywhere, and Bauhaus ideas. So is there still a Bauhaus, a place you go, this is the Bauhaus? No, but you can go everywhere. Here, I mean, honestly, the things we make you do in basic design classes, 2D design classes, are not far removed from the sorts of things that it impacted. I hate that word, because impacted is not really a word. It had impact on how design is taught in the world, right? So, is there a Bauhaus? No. Is there a Bauhaus? Yes, right? There are Bauhaus ideas everywhere, right? It's sort of like the breakup of the, we talked, when the Beatles first broke up, we all thought, when the Beatles first broke up in '69, everybody thought, cool, we'll get 4 times as many records now, right? And for about a year that worked. You got a couple good ones from John, you got a couple good ones from Paul, even Ringo came out with a good record, right? And George came out with this 3-record box set. You know, like, okay, it worked for about a year and a half, 2 years. And then they all sort of like lost it after that. Well, that's Bauhaus. When you broke up the Bauhaus, you got Bauhäuser. That's the German plural for house, right? You got Bauhäuser instead of a single Bauhaus. Okay? Wow, that was like a 20-minute question. Yes, please, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, it's all right.
Okay, well, what is the building function of now?
I believe it's a mecca for people like me.
So people,
who want to go and take pictures and see what it all looked like.
okay.
I think it's like a functioning museum.
Okay. Have you been there?
I haven't traveled a lot in Germany because of my wife. Whenever we get any extra money, wants to go to France.
Yeah, I was gonna
Right.
say.
So I would love to go there, but I just have not been.
Well, she's
Because there's only so much time on vacation. We have to hire a dog sitter. I don't. That's not why we're here. Okay.
I volunteered.
Yeah, you volunteer to dog sit. Okay.
We all volunteer.
We'll all volunteer.
Volunteer for dog sitting or going to Bauhaus?
Yes. Both. Yes. Take the dog.
All right. So, in addition to so now we'll go back to where we were before, right? In addition to Kandinsky, Gropius hires other constructivists. Again, communists coming out of Eastern Europe to come and work at the Bauhaus. So, at the same year Kandinsky comes, Moholy-Nagy comes as well, right? And this constructivist focus was a strong part of Bauhaus teaching in the 20s. And we'll look at some Bauhaus designs eventually, but we're going to talk about the fine artists, right? And the constructivists were attractive to the Bauhaus because of the central constructivist ideas that new technologies and new materials could improve humanity, right? And for the Soviets, right, the early Russian, the socialist constructivists, this was all about building a new society. And with the Bauhaus coming in, they're going to become that much more pragmatic about it, right? I really like this painting, right? That's painted pegboard. It's not real pegboard. It looks like the sort of thing that your dad used to hang tools in the garage, you know, with the little metal hooks. But it's not. It's all, everything here is painted. There's no sort of revealed materials here. And it's rather a quite large picture. It's over 4 feet tall, right? Rather big. Jamie.
So is the feeling of this era still like the Orpheus era where machines are going to save the world?
I think so, yes, definitely. This is still the sort of the positive, although I want to reframe your question, of this period. With this particular group of artists in this period, yes. We're going to look at other artists. We would have gotten there today. If it weren't for you guys. I'm going to tell you right now, if it weren't for you students, I could totally teach better. We actually make this joke every summer. Like long about August 15th, we go, oh man, the students are coming back. Now I'm not going to get anything done. Right? Anyway, we won't get there today probably, but there's another group of German artists, Jamie, that are beginning to see the downside of it. And you know who they are? They're the ones that served in the war, who watched tanks and airplanes dropping mustard gas. And they started to realize, exactly, it's the futurist dream, right? Woohoo! Tanks and mustards dropping, planes dropping mustard gas. Great. The great hygiene of society, war. Well, the people who sat in the trenches and watched, their best friends die in the mud, right, are traumatized by the war, by how industry has made us more efficient killing machines, right? And we'll look at them, right? And it's a kind of a hard group of artists to look at because they're so jaded. But for Moholy-Nagy, because he's Hungarian, okay, for Kandinsky, because he's in Russia, they still hold that sort of pre-war utopian hope for the future. And that hope for the future and the idea that industry can build a better future was also very much bolstered and continued by the Bolshevik Revolution, right? Had a huge part in continuing that idea amongst a certain group of people with a similar mindset, right? Okay, so on the right, that's a lithograph on the right, and you can see its basic constructivist ideas, transparency, geometry, forms being built, constructed together, references to Gabo, perhaps, or Pevsner in the sort of transparent semicircle down below, seemingly transparent, right, because it's a lithograph. On the left, again, the way the forms overlay and suggest a transparency, how forms change color as they move behind other forms. I really like this picture. I think this is really terrific, right? And again, as the constructivists, we're building together these forms, and there's always, it seems, a really strong dynamism to the way in which the forms fit together. They love diagonals, and Moholy-Nagy has a fantastic eye when it comes to composing these. And eventually he gave up painting. He gave up working on either lithographs or paintings altogether and became a photographer, right? Look, isn't that fantastic? This is a radio tower in Berlin, which was like over 1,000 feet tall, massive radio tower. We've seen other, right, when we looked at Rodchenko, we talked about how constructivist photographers love images of industrial architecture because it reveals its materials, like the Bauhaus does, right? And in this case, he takes this point of view, like Rodchenko had done, that is an alienating point of view. You start looking at it as a landscape seen from above, and you start to look at it as a series of geometric forms on a two-dimensional surface. In particular, the square at the bottom of the tower, the series of, I would assume those are picnic table umbrellas, right? That just become a series of sort of circular punctuations. Right? And then this amazing perspective sweep of the radio tower. But the German word for radio tower is better. It's Funkturm. F-U-N-K-T-U-R-M. Funkturm is German radio tower. But I put it as the Berliner Funkturm. I've always wondered if that's where funk comes from, the term. But in the word funk, but anyway, radio, right, is funk. And this wonderful circle right down below. And you look at this. I mean, if I flip that, right, I'm just now seeing this. But if I flip this, we're talking about almost, you're already thinking that? It's a mirror of the composition, isn't it? Many of the same compositional elements are overplaying between the two. But that predates this, right? So, again, for the constructivists, the idea, and this goes back to Jamie's question from a minute ago, are we still in a period when artists see industry as salvation, right? And when a picture like this, where industry allows the artist a view that he did not have or would not have otherwise, and a view that elevates him above the world and gives him not a bird's eye view, but a God's eye view of the world, then yeah, we're right there, right? We're still deeply mired in that. Now, he's teaching at the Bauhaus when he's doing this, and so he's very much interested. Oh, well, let's hear. I've got some This is at the Bauhaus, right? So this is one of the Bauhaus students playing on the balcony of each little. Imagine if in one of ours, everybody got their own little balcony. It'd be kind of cool, right? Everybody would be throwing water. They'd be doing that. Right? They'd be doing what that kid is doing right here, right?
I think that's what they're afraid of.
Exactly right. That's what I'm saying. That's why they don't do it, right? But he has this amazing eye, and he uses photography to allow him to do things that he couldn't do as a painter. And I think it was it Moholy-Nagy? I had this quote, and I can't remember if it's Moholy-Nagy or Rodchenko that said that photography allowed me to finally get rid of the rules of painting, right? To see the world in a new and a different way. Every one of these are just fantastic, right? They're really still 80, 90 years later. They're incredibly modern looking, where he focuses on these swooping perspectives, architectonic forms, but then masks them with other elements that give you the geometric shaping around them. And he's really using photography to do things he couldn't do with painting. Right? Now, one of the things he started doing with photography, because he's realizing that it allows us to do things that you can't do in painting, is he starts to experiment with what photography really is. He begins to look at photography as a technique. And I've talked to some of you guys about printmaking this way, right? Now that we got this printmaking. Once you realize what printmaking is, you start to realize all the possibilities there are for doing something that's basically a print. You know? Everything's a print. Right? And Moholy-Nagy, once he realizes that this thing that we're looking at here is the result of a negative that allows light through parts of it but blocks light in other parts of it, right? And that then hits a piece of photosensitive paper that transfers that image. It's image transfer, right? By laying one thing on another and allowing light to pass through it, okay? Which is, by the way, if you think about that in that image, the masking of that grill work, okay, when you get to that point where you realize that that's what a photograph is, who the heck needs the negative? Why don't you just start laying transparent things on the photosensitive paper? And that's what he does. Some of them transparent, some of them solid. He calls them photograms. He's realizing the potential of this new media to do fantastic things, right? Because again, a photograph is a negative projected onto a piece of photosensitive paper. He decides to upend the process and instead lay things directly on the paper and then turn on the light, right? And allow it to expose, right? Again, the nature of the technique, right? Bauhaus is a place where techniques are being investigated, right? Form follows function. And Moholy-Nagy is taking photography in a place that really hadn't been going anywhere at this point. There's one other person in the 20s doing the same thing, right? Man Ray, he calls them rayograms, and we'll look at those eventually, right? But it's basically the same idea. Yeah, Elaine.
How do you do it? You put it at
Okay.
the-
So in a dark room, right, the way a dark room works is that you've got a piece of paper that has been treated so that as soon as it's exposed to light, parts of it will turn dark. The part where the light's hit will turn dark. Okay? And the way of in the dark room, I've never done dark room. My dad did, but I don't know. So you that's why you have a dark room, right? It doesn't and red light won't affect it, but bright bluish light will. Okay? So you go into the dark room with your negative. So you've taken your camera, exposes this piece of celluloid, and makes a reverse image of the image, right? So the blacks are light sensitive. And you take that into, and his were probably about like this big, right? These large frame cameras. And you take that into the dark room, and you've got a piece of machinery with a light in it, and you You slide your negative into the light, and you put your piece of photosensitive paper on the table underneath it. And this is all working in the dark, right? A tiny little dim red light in the corner so you can barely see. And a little light outside to tell people not to come in, right? Because as soon as the door opens, it's all moving. So you've got that there, you've got the negative, and you flip on the light, and the negative projects down onto the paper, and it still looks in the projection, right, like what I said, would look like the negative, but eventually the paper is being exposed, okay? And then if you know what you're doing, it takes a lot of practice, right? You leave the light up to the right time. You can, what they do called dodge it, where you can put a piece of paper over part of it. I don't want that to expose as much. I want this to expose more, right? Flip the light off, take the paper, and then you put it in water because you have to stop the process. And at that point, then this picture slowly emerges out. That's the darkening process. Okay? Now, if you do that, got this machine, got the light, got the table, got the paper, and just decide I'm going to, here's my paper, I'm going to go. Right? Flip on the light. Right? Turn it off. Here, right? I go in and look and see what I got. Okay? And put that into the, so what he's done here, we've got some machine parts like a gyroscope maybe, a piece of oval plexiglass, some springs, right? Some square things, 5 or 6 square things have been dropped on there as well, then exposed. Okay? And exactly, and the hand in multiple exposures too, right? Again, it's like, okay, boom, boom, right? And how they're actually done is still, to me, a bit of a mystery, right? The actual, I have, and we could. Is it, you find it online, you can do this tonight. Well, tomorrow. Since tonight it'll be dark. There's something called cyanotype. And I've got some cyanotype chemicals in my office, right? You paint the sheet with cyanotype. It's a mixture of nickel and something else. And it's blue. Beautiful, right? And you get this piece of paper that looks kind of yellow at first. And then you expose it to light, and any place light hit it turns deep, deep dark blue. Right? And the other parts stay white. Right? So I had some students do this last year, where they not, you know, and so your bottle would do something different, right, than your phone would because it would allow light through it. And I bought it at. Have you done these before, Sam?
You showed me,
That one where we did the broken
yeah.
glass.
yeah.
Yeah. You put a piece of glass on it and hit it with a hammer, and just to see what the craft pattern would look like, right? And we were trying to do it at 5 in the afternoon, but right now it's perfect, bright sun. Right? But I couldn't take you to do it right now because it takes like an hour to cure, and I'm supposed to meet people after class, and so forth and so on. If you guys want to do a cyanotype sometime, come and send me an email, maybe get a bunch of names together, we'll do a workshop. Right? So you can do this stuff. And you can still buy darkroom chemicals, right? But they're toxic, so you gotta be careful.
But because you said your father had.
Yeah, my father did darkroom stuff when I was a kid, but he stopped doing his own darkroom when I was like, right? But yeah, had a place in the basement of our house in Portland. There's a little light outside that said, "Kids don't come in." Right, Dad. And I don't know if he was always doing darkroom when he had that light on. Sometimes he might have just wanted some downtime, or with his magazines. I don't know what he's doing. But okay, so and again, this whole idea of him playing with the thing, and that was a horrible thing to say about my dear departed father. Except that I'm not going there. He then took the exposure and figured out a way to turn that into a negative and come up with a positive based on it. Right? Because again, it's all about what is the process of photography and what can I then do with it. Right? These are fantastic, aren't they? They're just these really amazing sort of exploration of material. And that's what links it to the Bauhaus, which is this fundamental understanding of materials and techniques, is what the Bauhaus taught. And Moholy-Nagy's photographs, his photograms, right, are exactly that, a fundamental understanding of materials and techniques, and exploiting the possibilities that are there, that have yet to be exploited in traditional practices. Now, other people at the Bauhaus. Oskar Schlemmer was hired by Gropius to be the head of the sculpture department at the Bauhaus. Since they're architects, they see architecture as being the container for all of the arts, right? So if you're going to learn architecture, you better learn how to paint. You better learn how to sculpt. You better learn how to make prints, photographs. You better learn how to work with glass, right? You better learn all these things because architecture is more than just Gaiac Hall, right? Architecture is the artistic understanding of the materials and how they work together, right? So sculpture is part of that because it's a full understanding of three-dimensional form. Painting is part of that, right? Understanding of composition. So Oskar Schlemmer is hired as the head of the sculpture department at the Bauhaus. And again, I think this continues to answer Jamie's question from a while back. Do they still see the machine as the savior of mankind? Right? And Schlemmer loves these mechano-men, as did many of the constructivists, right? Where we think of, and robots, right, are a brand new thing. The word, have we talked about robots in this class yet?
No.
Did we get there? Okay, I don't have this in my notes, and so I'm making this up.
Got it.
Kind of, right? I have this in one of my notes somewhere, but not in front of me. The word robot was first coined by a Czechoslovakian writer named Lem, L-E-M. I can't remember his first name. Wilfredo. Anyway, last name is Lem. Wilfredo Lem is a painter. And around 1920, 1921 is the first time we see it. So there's this upswing in science fiction lit, right? And the idea of a robot as a mechanical man, right? Now those ideas predate this. You can find robots in movies, right? Going back to the very early cinema around 1900, you can find these things, right? But calling them robots and understanding the way that we think of robots, right? In a pre-Android, Blade Runner, what was that Oscar Isaac movie a couple years ago about the woman, where the kid's invited to his mountain retreat and he's made an android woman who doesn't know she's an android. Anyway, we now think of, like, we're now more concerned with these robots that look like us, right? That have skin, but underneath there's machinery. But the idea of a robot that looked like a machine is kind of everywhere in the 1920s. Pardon me?
Like a Tin Man on the Wizard of Oz. A Tin Man.
The Tin Man and the Wizard of Oz. Where was the Wizard of Oz written? But yes.
That was the first movie.
The movie's 1939. That much I know. When was the novel written? Right?
I thought it was
I don't know.
yeah, it was a political novel.
Yeah, I have.
It'd be interesting to figure that out, right? Where that fits in there as well. Hey, there's a topic for you. The Tin Man as a Bauhaus figure. Right? Go to a conference, man. You get people turning out. Schlemmer also did paintings with the same idea, right? These ideas of mechno-men, right? And again, we've seen these in the, you're here. Allie, help Margaret out. Would you close that? Close that. Margaret's dying there. Help your friend out. Great, there you go. And that's actually better for the screen anyway. So he made these paintings as well, and in this particular case, he even uses silver paint, right? So the main figure is not gray, but is actually reflective silver paint. And Schlemmer is kind of an interesting character in that he was, not only was he the head of the sculpture department, but eventually he also became, within a year, the head of the theater department. And this is what's really cool. Here's a Bauhaus theater design.
So we have
Right.
this.
The thing that I think I like most about the Bauhaus is the degree to which, and see this kind of in you guys. But there's an untapped potential there. It is a small community where everybody knows each other. And when they decide to get together to do something, they decide to get together to do something. Right? And they throw all of their energies into it. And the school was set up to support that kind of creativity. Right? So Schlemmer comes up with this thing called the Triadic Ballet. And the students get together to make these costumes. Right? They also had regular costume balls. And there was this thing about one of the things they most often did was to turn themselves into machines that would expand into the space around them, right? So I've never seen a moving version of the Triadic Ballet, people in action from the time. But there are all these photographs these are Bauhaus students in the 1920s, right? Goofing off at the Bauhaus. And that ability, they all know each other. You guys all know each other. It's not the only class you have with the other people in this room. There's this untapped potential here, guys, to just, there's a creative well that's there, that get together and do things like this, right? Yep. I had Lena first. Elaine.
Okay. The earlier ballet that was in Russia, that you,
Right.
is this kind of, because I know that you said we don't have pictures of what the costume
Right.
is, but because it's the same.
Since I don't have pictures, I can't imagine that these are the kinds of costumes that Malevich would have come up with.
Well, no.
Like
but
that guy in the back. Look at the guy in the back with
Is
his
that a guy?
radiating circles.
I thought that was a lady.
This one, I think I've seen other pictures
Could be
of
both.
it, and I think it's a him,
Okay.
right? But they're just fantastic. They're surreal, aren't they? I mean, they're just, the body has been totally transformed into something else, right? Elaine, and then I'll show you two more pictures real quick.
Yeah, and about triadic, instead of something three, and because this picture has three figures, and
I wonder, I don't know the answer to that, but that's a very good point. The triadic and the threes and tripling, right? Here's another picture. Bauhaus student life, right? Isn't this fantastic? Right?
It's actually scary.
I kind of think it is. I mean, well, we're so close to Halloween, it's kind of perfect. Does this not make you rethink your Halloween costume? Right?
Scary people.
This one's really creepy, I
This is
think.
what
But
happens when you let art students be free.
right. But we'll pick up with this. I'm almost done with the Bauhaus. We'll look at some Bauhaus designs on Tuesday, and we'll move on to German Expressionism on Tuesday, the last sort of leg of German Expressionism. Okay? So, thank you for staying a little bit late. Sorry I ran over.
But